So thank you so much, everyone, for coming tonight, and thank you so much to AIIA Queensland for agreeing to co-host this really amazing event with Women in International Security Australia, also known as WISE-A. I'll just quickly give a very brief spiel about WISE-A if you are interested in learning more about us. WISE-A is a not-for-profit organisation which connects Australian women and allies in the field of international security through a range of events and initiatives, including this event here tonight. And the reason why WISE-A exists is clear. Although women are increasingly being included within the field of international peace and security, gender inequalities still persist, especially at senior levels of leadership. So there's obviously a lot more you can learn about on WISE. We have a website, we have social media, and feel free to talk to myself or my colleague Seon, who's also a member of WISE as well, if you would like to learn more about us and to potentially join us as well. So I'll turn to the panel discussion for tonight. I'm extremely delighted to be chairing this esteemed panel on a topic that's extremely close to my own heart as a young woman of colour. While we all know that diversity is important when it comes to international affairs, we also know that we need to prioritise an intersectional lens when it comes to diversity. So what is intersectionality? This term was coined in 1989 by an American scholar called Kimberly Crenshaw, and this concept talks about how we should be taking into account the overlapping elements of an individual's identity, such as their age, their gender, their class, sexuality, and disability status, when it comes to understanding their experience on the personal and professional levels. So to unpack this concept a bit further and to explore exactly how it impacts the experience of women within the field of international affairs, I'm really excited to be joined by this panel of esteemed experts. So I'll go from my left. Well, I'll go from closest to furthest. So we have Zoe Heath, who is a policy officer, youth advocate, and founder of #Submission Sunday, an initiative aimed at supporting youth participation in the parliamentary and government decision-making process. Zoe is the submissions coordinator with Voices of Influence Australia and also is a youth advisor on numerous youth advisory councils. In 2023, Zoe was recognised as a young woman to watch in international affairs. And then after Zoe, we have Dr. Helen Ferrance, who is a senior lecturer in international relations at Griffith University, and she also holds a PhD from the University of Queensland. Helen has recently completed a 4-year Australian Research Council DECRA Fellowship on Youth Leadership and the Youth Peace and Security Agenda. Her research draws on peace studies, feminist international relations, and critical security studies to consider representations of children and youth in crises and conflicts. We also have Seon Park. Seon is a final year PhD candidate in the School of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Queensland. Her research focuses on the regulation of ISIS women returnees in the UK and Australia, exploring how legislation, narratives, and practices shape distinct gendered outcomes for these women. Seon is also the Director of Research at WISE-A, and in particular in this role, she has a strong commitment to increasing the participation of women of colour. And last but not least, we have Dr. Julie Balgari, who is a proud Gumbaigi and Ngati woman and lecturer in political science and Indigenous politics at Griffith University. Prior to her PhD and lecturer position, Julie completed a Bachelor of Education with Honours and spent several years working in remote and low SES community schools. Julie is passionate about Indigenous rights and issues and how Indigenous voices can help to strengthen policy and outcomes. So honestly, I feel very intimidated, honestly, to be chairing this discussion with a really distinguished range of women. And honestly, I feel like I need to get my PhD just to be on the same level as everyone else here. So I'm not going to make this about myself. We want to hear from the panelists tonight. And of course, we really want to hear from the audience as well. So after we have a few questions, we'll turn to audience Q&A, and we'll also have people joining us online as well. We also have special shout out to the President of Women in International Security Australia, Marie, who's joining us online as well. So it's really fantastic to see participation from around Australia and people online as well. So we'll get onto questions a bit later. So the first question is for all the panelists, and this is just a very broad question to understand what exactly is intersectionality. I mean, I provided a very, very brief summary of some of the academic theory perspective of it, but I'd love to know from each of you, what does intersectionality mean to you? And so I'll start with Zoe and we'll just go down the panel.
When I think of intersectionality, I think it sort of triggers in me thoughts around sort of acknowledging that many of us inhabit lots of different social identities that's tied to our gender, our age, First Nation status, culturally, linguistically diverse community, disabled, socioeconomic background, and so on. And many of us inhabit many of these diverse communities, and I think so intersectionality is the acknowledgement that these identities don't exist in isolation or in silos from one another, and in fact they sort of interact. And I think for me, I think acknowledging that and not acknowledging that not only are we informed by our identities and our experiences, but also how those identities and experiences interact with one another. I think. Sorry, we just heard something. I think I thought I was giving a good answer, but apparently not. I think that's what intersectionality means to me, that sort of acknowledgement of our diversity, but also the sort of connection between that diversity as well.
Thanks. It's, I might build off what Zoe was saying, and also the way in which you introduced the concept of intersectionality, because I think one of the really important kind of elements of the discussion when we talk about intersectionality and when we're talking about what Kimberly Crenshaw kind of put forward is not simply that we have different identities, but that those identities exist in unequal power relations with each other, and that because of your identity you can be oppressed or discriminated against in multiple ways. And to understand that, we have to understand it not only by being a woman through gender, but perhaps by your race or your social economic status and things. So given my own position and experience of having privilege, of being a white woman, of being a cis-het white woman in a global north country, you know, all those kind of things, there's a lot of benefits that accrue to me in ways that don't accrue to other people. And so I think when we have these conversations about intersectionality, one of the things we really need to think about is the fact that those who perhaps do experience more forms of discrimination or exclusion shouldn't have to be doing all the work to address those inequalities. And those of us who do have privilege, power in various ways need to kind of do the work to resist the tokenization and do the learning and do the understanding about what our role is to address those things as well. So I think that the politics that's in it is really important, and we've got to resist that just talking about different identity features as some abstract thing. So yes.
Still? You're making it very hard for me to add on to it.
We started this thing.
We thought it would be a good idea to sit here because Afia warned us that she would be going in order of seating. Not my wisest. Oh, wisest. Not my wisest choice, but for me, I think adding on to everything that has been said so far is, you know, intersectionality for me is just that it's an understanding, not only in academic terms, but it's an understanding that we are all in unique standpoints and where we are in our lives and in our identities. And it's also the understanding that no two person is going to experience life or politics or society in similar ways to each other. So I guess to add a more normative point to what's been discussed so far this evening, it'd be important for us to move forward to a place where it's possible for us to discuss these differences. It's possible for us to open up discussions on how we can move forward in order to incorporate more intersectional, not only analyses, but also perspectives just in our day-to-day lives as well. Because if we don't do that in our daily lives, that cannot be added onto policy or different, I guess, or can be, or nor can it be enforced and changed in government as well. So I guess that's my 2 cents.
Now this is the tough seat. I guess I want to start by just adding to the academic conversation. And we all know Kimberly Crenshaw was the person that coined it in 1989, but it's also that we pay homage to the Black feminist movement in the early 19th century that started this movement in itself. And I think that in itself, when you think about it in going back and thinking about that and where it is now, it was those marginalised voices that was able to step forward and make those commentaries, understanding that it's not just a women woman problem or a race problem. And it wasn't coined intersectionality, but there are lots of different terms that were used prior to that. And so Kimberly Crenshaw then coined it, and it's something that we've taken. And I think what we can take away from that is that we need to really privilege the minority voices. So when we speak about gender, I'm a Gumbaynggirr Dangari woman, so I'm an Indigenous Australian. Often Indigenous women are left out of the conversation when we talk about women's issues, or we talk about childcare or care policies. We don't think about it from a different perspective other than a non-Indigenous or whatever the parliamentarians sort of look like, and the idea of care, which is linked to GDP. So I'm not sure if I've actually added anything or I've gone way off on a tangent, but I think it's about understanding experiences of those minorities and ensuring that whilst there's understanding identity and experiences, that we do the analyses, because Kimberly Crenshaw has said many times that it hasn't lacked the depth. Intersectionality has not. We just talk very much on the surface about those identities and experiences without actually critiquing political structures or political forces and things like that that shape our world. And I think it's really important if we want transformative change going into the future, sustainable transformative change, that we look at different viewpoints of different people, particularly marginalised groups, because they are most disadvantaged people in society. And so if we can raise those people up, it pushes us all up. We all rise together.
I think everyone's points were really spot on and in a lot of different ways. And as you mentioned, Julie, like, we're not just looking at it from 1989, this is when the concept was turned, but also this is an issue that in different forms in history has been conceptualized in different societies in different ways. And also the fact that we shouldn't just be looking at this in a surface level, but it is about saying that not only do we have these identities, but interrogating concepts such as privilege and how should we use our voices, and the fact we have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I hope that this discussion can be a starting point to try and get people to think more deeply and also think in their own workplaces and their own lives as well. How can we interrogate these concepts of privilege and being able to see how we can act as allies to each other as well? Because in some way we all are privileged, or in some way we might be marginalised, but it's about these joint efforts to really elevate all these voices. So I'll go on to the next question then, and in particular, let's bring it to this field of international affairs, which we all relate to in somehow way, or we all work within this field. So in particular, what exactly is the value of bringing an intersectional lens to the field of international affairs? I'll start with you, Zoe. Just okay.
I think fundamentally that intersectionality is sort of the foundation of good policy making. And I think that's true for domestic affairs and international affairs and any other affairs in between. I think we sort of started moving on in sort of policy making and acknowledging that people come from many diverse backgrounds, and those diverse backgrounds sort of intersect with one another. And we've sort of moved on from, well, we're just going to make one policy, and you know, we're going to make one policy for all women, and it's all going to work for all women. I think hopefully we've sort of moved on from that a bit, and we can sort of acknowledge that if we want to make policy, and particularly policy that affects other people, and particularly policy that affects diverse and often marginalised groups, we need to acknowledge the intersectionality, both in the sort of experiences of those groups and how they intersect with one another. You know, we can't make a policy for women without acknowledging the experiences that First Nations women, that culturally and linguistically diverse women, disabled women, and women from many other diverse backgrounds also experience, and also how those also interact with one another. I think our international affairs policy has to be underpinned by intersectionality for it to be effective, and for Australia to sort of be leading in this field. And I don't know we're quite there yet, but I think we are starting to acknowledge that intersectionality has to be sort of the foundations of our approach to international affairs.
Yeah, no, that's a really great insight. Also, another follow-up question actually to you. Because I know we mentioned in the intro that you're engaged in a lot of youth advisory councils. So from that youth perspective, can you provide any examples of exactly how do you provide that nuance when it comes to having that youth perspective, but then also making sure if it is a policy about women or females, and how do we integrate the perspective of young females, for example?
Yeah. Well, I think particularly the youth perspective is something that's particularly unique because in sort of the advocacy sort of field we talk about a lot about lived experience, and the importance of listening to lived experience. And youth is one of those ones which is unique because we were all are or were young once. It's one of the lived experiences that all of us have in common. I think fundamentally when we are trying to bring youth into the conversation when it comes into international affairs, intersectionality, I think it's important to, just ask them. I think they are often, for better or worse, young people often find there's lots of barriers to engaging in these conversations. I think it's important that, we have, people with experience and people with, strong academic backgrounds and connections and stuff like that to be in these, more powerful positions, but I think also it's also important to acknowledge that young people are experts in being young and experts in their lived experience, and to make sure that we're privileging that sort of lived experience in our policy making and using that to inform our policy making when it comes to international affairs and intersectionality, and also not just seeing sort of young people as a sort of like a monolith of all young people agree to like this certain thing or don't like this certain thing. Young people are as diverse as any other group in society, and it's important to treat them as such through actually directly consulting with them and listening to lived experiences and not expecting them to have everyone. I think many diverse communities sort of have this sort of experience of like it feels like everyone has to agree to sort of advocate and to have change, and that's not how people work. That's not how anyone works, and it's unfair to expect any diverse group in society to all fundamentally agree on the same thing. And we need to also treat young people like that, and treat young people particularly when policies directly affect them, and as young people sort of are expected to inherit the earth, they are sort of stakeholders in a lot of policies. To sort of acknowledge that and actually make efforts and genuinely and authentically engage with young people and listen to them and actually act upon what they say. I think that's sort of what we sort of need to sort of empower that sort of youth perspective in international affairs. I think also inherently young people are generally just more diverse currently than they have than older generations, and along with privileging and up that young voice, you're going to get also more young intersectional diverse people giving their voices as well.
And that's a really great point. I think, as you said, young people are going to inherit the so yeah, I'll take this one. As you said, young people are going to inherit the earth. So when it comes to issues like climate change, whether we acquire nuclear powered submarines, all these issues is going to impact the next generation, not the dinosaurs in government who are going to die in the next decade. So I'm sorry if anyone's a dinosaur in government, but as a young person, I feel very passionately about this as well. Julie, I'll turn to you on this question, and in particular, you've highlighted that when it comes to engaging women, in particular, we need to ensure that First Nations women are also engaged in the conversation. So, but as Zoe's highlighted, of course, we can't just treat any group as a monolith. So can you speak a bit about that, about maybe what is some of the perspectives when it comes to First Nations women in international affairs, but then also some of the differences that might emerge? You only have one microphone now.
I think that's a really great question, and it's a really complex question, and it goes to the point about intersectionality as well. Let me start by saying this. So I'm a Gumbaynggirr Dangari woman, which I've already said to you. My family come from the mid-north coast of New South Wales. I wasn't born on country and I didn't grow up on country. I was born on Gubbi country, which is Redcliffe. and I currently still live on Gubbi Gubbi country, and I've grown up in an urban area. I have a different life trajectory or experiences to other First Nations women who have grown up in rural or remote communities, or who have grown up on their country in urban areas. So that in itself is a very loaded question. And I think this is the importance of the discussion that we're having tonight about intersectionality, is that one person is not the spokesperson, and I'm not the spokesperson for Indigenous women across Australia. I'm here speaking on my perspectives and trying to unpack it a little bit. I think when we come to understanding various different positions, I think I'm a big advocate that the domestic should mirror the international, particularly in the Indigenous affairs, because you cannot, and I have done a lot of work in the First Nations foreign policy space, and we currently have an ambassador for First Nations Australians who may or may not stay in the position depending on the next government. But the commitment that the current government has made in terms of First Nations people in an international space is that Australia wants to start making those moves. And I mean, the government made those moves with the referendum last year, which unfortunately failed, and so on and so forth. But you have to do the work at home as well before you do the work outside. So I want to make that really clear. You can't advocate for other First Nations peoples as an ambassador and say, I am for upholding UNDRIP, which is the United Nations Declaration Rights of Indigenous Peoples, if your own country isn't doing that at home. Thinking about what I just described about my own position as an Aboriginal woman is that I have many facets of my identity and many facets of my experience, and which even include that my father was born in 1948, which in most circumstances at my age could have been my grandfather or maybe even great-grandfather, depending on how the birthing goes. So I have a different experience in that in terms of the transmission of traditional knowledge. When you think about that context and then you duplicate it out into the international arena, it's the same thing. So that's why I say the domestic is really important to understand and get right, because you can't duplicate that out. I think the other thing that's really important, and it happens a lot in the Pacific when we're looking at development programs, is that we often go in and say, this is what you should do, for example, to end violence against women, and we're going to give you this money and this funding, and we're going to tell you what goals you need to meet to get the funding and continue to get funding. And those things don't work in those communities because of the different experiences and different cultural values and whatnot. And so I think a possible solution, I'm not saying it's the only thing, but something that people can do in this space, particularly in international affairs, is understanding that local and place-based knowledge is really important, and that you centre the people. Sort of what Zoe was saying. I mean, it's just good policy, right? I'm a public policy scholar, right? So it's just way you make good policy. Unfortunately, it's not always followed. So it's about, in the international arena, particularly with Indigenous people across the globe have been marginalised. I mean, there's people in Southeast Asia that can't talk about being Indigenous without threat of being killed. Like, it's quite serious. And so it's about understanding those things and how can we make sure that people's human rights and that the rights of Indigenous peoples are being upheld, and understanding all the divergences of that. I was recently in Canberra at ANU at a Indigenous politics workshop, and we had an Indigenous Fijian scholar there, and he was talking about how it's really important to have things like cultural liaisons in those countries, and having Indigenous to Indigenous cultural liaisons that can support, say, for example, heads of states, or he gave the specific example of Michael McCormack going to Fiji and drinking 5 cups of kava and making an absolute fool of himself, which was an absolute disgrace to the Fijian people. So there's all of these things, and it's not just about traditional politics, how we understand it. It's also about understanding culture and protocols, and that isn't acceptable in that community. And he said a lot of the media had to quieten it down because it would have really disrupted relations between Fiji and Australia. So I don't know if I completely answered your question, but I gave something.
Doug, do you want to add anything to that question?
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think both of you really encapsulate well. We need to start domestic politics before we then sort of virtue signal and go into the international arena and take care of ourselves first. We'll go on to the third question, and this question specifically for Helen and Seon. So the time we live in is very challenging when it comes to global affairs. There's a US elections where we don't know what's going to happen, and I guess we'll find out in the next 24 hours. We have wars in the Middle East and Ukraine. So when it comes to this concept of intersectionality, what exactly are your practical recommendations about what we can do to bring that lens when it comes to these sorts of current issues that are occurring in the international arena?
Just a small question. How do
Yeah,
we-
exactly. Yeah, we're solving world problems here.
I think one of the things that is really important to think about is to think about what is missing in these conversations. So we're very good at talking about war, and we're very good at talking about state-to-state diplomacy, men in suits gathering to talk about these kind of things. But it's not the only place that politics happens, whether it's domestically or domestically overseas, and then also in the international spaces, regional spaces as well. So I think that one of the really practical questions that we can ask, whether we're just viewers of the news or whether we work in policy or whether we work in academia, is what's missing? Where are the gaps? What are we not talking about? What are we not discussing? And I say that with a note of caution, which is it's not always our place or our role to discuss and look at those things, but having an awareness that there are other perspectives and people and experiences that might be missing from what is being discussed, I think is perhaps a too simple but also very difficult to do thing that we can do. The other thing that I think is really important is thinking about who is doing the work. So it's not only about talking to the people with lived experience, but then who is in the roles in the government that are setting up the concept note or the call for submissions or the whatever it is, right? And are they in a position and have they reflected on not necessarily only an Indigenous woman can point out that we should probably talk about Indigenous issues, right? But that having Indigenous people there, as well as having young people there, as well as having people that have lived experience of disability or other things, makes it more likely then that the conversations include those perspectives. So I think when we're talking about the spaces in which these conversations are happening, whether they are policy or whether they are academic, or whether they are the fancy negotiation spaces where we're going to get peace in the Middle East over and over again, right? And we see those images of all the men in suits, like having those conversations, and it's just so obvious to me. I mean, where do we even start with who's missing in those conversations, right? But I also think we have evidence of it, and obviously, like in a whole range of spaces, right? You both talked about them. In the international context, when we're talking about wars and these kind of things, we know that when you include women in peace processes and decision making, the peace lasts longer, it is more durable, it is more embedded in community, right? Like that these are people that do the quantity stuff have proven it, right? I'm a deeply qualitative scholar. But that there is a relationship between having those voices and that presence at the decision-making table and the quality of the outcomes. And that's obviously only one dimension, right? In the work I do, there's a lot of conversations about including young people in the same way, right, to those kinds of conversations and things as well. The other thing that I think is really important, and it goes to, I guess, that nexus between what are we seeing as people and then what are we doing in whatever role we occupy, is where are we giving our attention? So for a very good reason, the Middle East is taking up a lot of attention at the moment, and we should be paying attention and deeply concerned about the violence that people are experiencing. But Sudan is also experiencing violence and particularly gendered and racialized and ageist violence and things as well. And it's not covered in our general media. And so to me, the question is, why are we as Australians interested in the Middle East and not in Sudan? And what is it about the pathways and the expectations that we develop in terms of our understanding of what's happening in the world that we're about to have 24-hour media coverage on ABC News of the US election, but I haven't seen a news article about Sudan on ABC News in the last however many weeks, right? So in terms of what matters to us, I think is also the point of reflection and entry for some of these things.
I think what's really important, as Helen said, is to consistently ask what we don't know about particular situations and what is missing, as Helen said, but also about what we can further find out about what is given in front of us. Because I think in the line of work that I do, especially I look at sort of terrorism related things, it's really difficult to know fully what we know and what we don't know. So I think having conversations about what we are able to really find out in certain circumstances and within certain contexts is important for us to advance conversation in how we can actually properly think about who is involved in those situations as well. And I think in a lot of these processes, as Helen said, and as everyone else has said, it's really important for us to ensure that there is proper representation in who is speaking. And for me, I think Afia might relate to this. I think it's really important that language is being taken into consideration, right? So that's not just linguistic language in the languages we speak. I speak Korean and English. I'm sure you all speak many languages, but it's also about the language of your lived experiences, right? So my language as someone who was raised in the West predominantly, but I'm still an Asian woman, that language, the language that I have as a person is going to be different to someone who is Asian and speaks English, but was raised in Asia, or let's say in a different context around the world. So to be able to incorporate people who speak these languages of lived experiences in these conversations, I think is paramount. And I think that is really important for us in order to actually find out what we are missing and what we don't know as well. And also what we can find out from these missing pieces. Because if we don't do that, then it's cliche, but we can get lost in translation. It's very easy for us to get lost in track of what we are actually doing. Oftentimes we start something with mighty intention and we keep doing it, and then in the middle of it all, we kind of just go, wait, what are we doing again? So in order to be, I guess, put in track and I guess really maintain our focus, we just need to be reminded constantly. And I think language in broad terms is really important for that. And we also need to, in my opinion, be able to speak more about differences within groups. And I think that's the beauty of intersectionality, right? Or intersectional perspectives is the fact that we are able to identify how one seemingly similar, uniform, generally monolithic looking group.
Sorry.
That's fine. Might have very different experiences. And I think that really comes out in the research that I do, and the research that we all do, is that, even if it looks like everyone is experiencing the same thing as a group, we are all experiencing different things. So in order for us to move, I guess, forward with intersectional practices, it shouldn't really only be about the differences between groups, but also the differences within groups and how we come to understand what constitutes our everyday sort of idea of what a group really means too. So I think that's it for me.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Take that again. Okay, but no, I think that was really fantastic insights there on. I know we've talked about this on an individual level in particular. Just a follow-up question for you though. Because like for both of us, we could say there are many commonalities in our experience. We're both Asian and Australian women, we're women of colour, we have these similar experiences as young people. But especially when it comes to this space of cultural diversity, something that I find really interesting is that there is this seemingly homogenous label of culturally and linguistically diverse. So I'd love to hear some of your insights around how that language impacts then our policy, and is the term like culturally and linguistically diverse actually useful, or what nuance do you think needs to be provided to that?
That's a really easy question. I think I have two answers to that. I think it's yes and no. And what I mean is the sort of idea that we need culturally and linguistically diverse perspectives important. Of course it's important. Of course that's necessary. But is it, I guess, doing anything in practice? Unfortunately, from what I see, not really. And I think the conversations that Afia and I have had in private have particularly reflected how, because everyone speaks different languages, and there's so many TED Talks out there that talk about that talk about how depending on which language you speak, your brain is shaped differently, and the way that we think is shaped differently. All right. So if you think about the sheer breadth of experiences and diverse sort of perspectives that we can bring in to conversations on policy, if we were actually able to gather more people with culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, that would be excellent. But we also need to think about which linguistically diverse people are being more prioritized in practice, right? Because there's going to be another layer of intersectionality embedded in those dimensions where people from more global north countries are going to find themselves in these positions more and more. I'm Korean. I was born in Korea, but I've never lived in Korea. I was only a few months old when my parents moved back to New Zealand, and we moved here when I was going into high school. I speak Korean, I speak the language, but in recent times, we also know that Korea has grown into this massive soft power nation where everyone knows where Korea is now, K-pop, K-drama, all that. It's such a massive thing. And so the way that people perceive Korea, for me, I feel has changed so dramatically in my childhood. I think I said this to Afia. The defining moment in my life where people stopped asking me whether I was from North Korea or South Korea was when Psy's Gangnam Style came out. That was the moment people stopped asking me. And it's a funny thing, and it's a soft power thing, but it's also very real, because that's when I really felt that people's perspective of my country had changed. And the reason why I'm talking about this is because not every country goes through this very dramatic shift in a short amount of time. Not saying that Korea was a very underdeveloped country before Gangnam Style. I know but just in terms of soft power and how we view South Korea, things have changed. I'm not sure if that's going to happen to many countries who we typically view as global South. So I think what's more important than trying to include these linguistically diverse opinions is trying to include, I guess, opinions from different. I want to say this in a way that is really, really wise. But viewpoints that are from everywhere, not just from particular places of the world. So I guess that's my 2 cents, is that it's important, but we also need to be mindful of where those voices are coming from and whether or not they're coming from particular areas.
Well, I think this is working again. Excellent. So we have 2 somewhat working microphones. But yeah, no, that was an excellent point, Seon. Yeah, maybe turn that off. Is this working now? Yeah, okay. It just works one at a time. But I think in particular, maybe I'll try that one again. Apologies for the technical difficulties. Okay, is that working? But yeah, I think definitely as well. Even for me, like I was born in Australia, I was raised here. I grew up in a bilingual household with my parents from Bangladesh. But like I acknowledge that privilege and that difference of experience compared to migrants who come from overseas, especially from global South countries, right? So even when there is this very broad label like culturally and linguistically diverse, where is that nuance in terms of ensuring that it isn't just a privileged group that we're looking at within that? So we'll turn to Q&A now. So we have a lot of people online and also people in person. So if you have a question, feel free to put up your hand. We already have a few hands up. And then, yeah, I think we'll just, I guess we can pass around this microphone or another microphone.
Can hear them. They can hear it too.
Okay. Yeah, I think, yeah, if you have a question, feel free just to say it, and then, yeah, we can direct it at the panelists. Yep, we have a question here.
I thank you all for sharing yourself.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so yeah, who you are and where you're from.
My name's Soraya. I'm classed as youth. So, so a woman. So this was very, very informative to me. I go to Griffith University and I study a double degree in business, government, and international relations, majoring in security, conflict, and human rights. I would say that my passions as of now are very much in advocacy, in youth, in multiculturalism. And I have two bits of experience recently from two internships, one with the Department of Justice in the First Nations Justice Office, and then one in the Multicultural Communities Council. So I guess my question would be for you two. How would you, because I understand the want and the passion behind a lot of youth wanting to make a change in, I guess, multicultural advocacy and in Indigenous communities. My roadblock comes from how do we take all of this passion, this knowledge, these voices, and then turn it into something that will genuinely make a difference that isn't following the trajectory of what's currently happening. Because I find, at least I have access to many platforms where I can create a space to share these voices and to bring these voices to the table. But I guess I just don't know, like, what do you find is missing in this current world that we have? What do you want to hear that hasn't been said before?
I think in the Indigenous space, so as Afia mentioned earlier, I was a teacher previously, and I went into education because I believe education is so important and it's very powerful and it can change the world. I worked in education for many, many years and realised there was only so much I could do. But in saying that, coming from things like the referendum last year and the way that Australia understands Indigenous issues, education is fundamentally important. And it's something, if you listen to all First Nations people, particularly our elders, they'll all talk about education. The problem is education is highly political. Whether we understand that or not, it is highly political. We still have arguments in Parliament about what should or shouldn't be in the curriculum, what books should and shouldn't be in libraries. So, I mean, it's not anything new. I'm sorry, I can't give you anything new, but it's really just a staple of our society is education. Because when education and people are more informed, those voices will be listened to. Unfortunately, when people are ill-informed and they hear voices that align, and I mean, this is across the spectrum with our society at the moment. You only need to look at what's happening in the US right now. If I don't understand you or I don't want to listen to you, I'm going to listen to this and I'm not going to be educated on it, right? I'm going to stick to my lane. And so we're seeing the same thing replicate here, and we've seen it in Australia with Indigenous issues forever. You need people to be educated to be able to listen to those people, or at least have the respect to listen to those people. And unfortunately, a lot of Indigenous Australians don't feel respected by the Australian community. And whilst we all have a differing opinion when the referendum happened last year, there were yes people, there were no people, and then there was progressive no and hard no. And when we think about those two things, the progressive no was they want a treaty. And what did treaty give them? A voice. They didn't think that that process is the way that it went. Unfortunately, the hard no's, and this is my personal opinion, please, this is my opinion, is that the people that had the hard no's, such as Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine, were politically motivated for their own means. Unfortunately, a lot of people who decided that they didn't want to vote no, and everybody's able to. We live in a democracy, right? But I don't feel like people have enough education to go to a vote on some people's fundamental rights. I don't think. And one of the top scholars in the world in Indigenous politics spoke on, I did a podcast around feminist and First Nations foreign policy, which looks at those intersects. Thank you. Said that if any country took a human rights issue to referendum, it would fail every time. So it's not anything new, but education is fundamentally important. But education is fundamentally changing in our country and every other country. We're not making informed citizens. We're not making people to think. We don't make people problem solve. The emergence of AI, as great as it is, and a tool that it can be, is going to set, I fear, society back a lot, because we still don't fundamentally have those basic things. So unfortunately, I can't give you anything new, but I think that education is paramount for everything, particularly for Indigenous voices to be heard. You know, Indigenous voices are heard when there's capitalistic gain behind it. So you only need to go to your social media and see people who do wonderful jobs. They're artists, they're, you know, they're singers, they're whatever. They have a platform because they're giving something to somebody and there's some transaction there. And that's how Western society works. And therefore they gain influence through that. They can give you something that you can attach yourself to them through their art. I don't know if that makes sense at all, but I don't think, you know, getting out there and standing on your soapbox like people used to is not going to go anywhere. You'll just be, tagged as, why. So, just basic education. That's my answer to that part of the question.
Thank you. Did I give you enough time?
I think I was struggling because I also couldn't think in the spot of something that hasn't already been spoken about before, but I guess in the line of what you've said, I guess I will say representation. Yeah, which is very, I think, in line with what you said. And I'll speak about East Asian perspectives just because that's where I'm sitting in community-wise, but also note that I'm not representing everyone from the East Asian community, just what I think. And I guess maybe I'll share some discussions that I've been having with my friends who are also from East Asian immigrant backgrounds. And what we think is that there's a lot of problems sort of happening at the same time in terms of why there's less East Asian representation, I guess, in Australian politics, because you go outside of Brisbane City, you see so many of us. You see so many of us, and yet you don't see the same amount of representation in politics. And that has always kind of confused me. I've always been dumbfounded by that. But, at the base level, and this is very typical immigrant Asian thinking, but at the moment, it's just not something that Asian immigrants are interested in going to politics. And that's why it's so important to have representation. It's to show people and immigrants, not only East Asian immigrants, but immigrants that come from, all different kinds of backgrounds, that it's possible for you to become someone that represents, your community's voices in politics in Australia. It's not something that is impossible just because you don't see it, but it's something that you can very much do if you want to. And I think the reason why that is so, it's a sort of problem where it goes both ways, right? You need representation, but in order for people to have, in order for people to want to join politics, they need to see representation to begin with. So it's this sort of double-edged problem. But, an example that I like to talk about is actually the referendum from last year. And I had a lot of ill-informed family friends, my parents' friends, who were voting no. And the reason why they were voting no was not because they didn't want Indigenous voices to be heard, but they had this misconception that if they vote yes, then their voices as an immigrant would be sidelined, and only matters related to Indigenous politics would be pushed to the forefront, which is absolutely not true. But I think there was just not enough discussion ongoing at the government level, to ensure that people were actually understanding what would happen if this referendum were to go forward and to be successful. And, even when we do have East Asian politicians in my council, there is Emily Kim, who is a UQ graduate. My friend, I feel so good saying that. My friend, Emily Kim, and maybe you've seen this on the ABC recently, but she's actually been sued by Pauline Hanson because go you. Maybe that's an achievement. I think it is. Because she actually encouraged us. I live in her ward. I live in the Callum Vale ward, and which is a very, very highly East Asian suburb, and she encouraged all of us knocking on doors to, not vote for the LNP in the upcoming state elections. And because of that, she was sued by Pauline Hanson. I'm not talking about this in very technical terms. You can read it up, but it's the problem that even when we do have representation, there's like another wave of problems that come afterwards, right? But I guess my point in saying all of this is that we need representation, regardless of what it takes, because if we don't, then there are way too many repercussions on it. There's too much misinformation, and that's why we need, I guess, representation so that they can educate, I guess, the voters on what sort of choices they can make and they can exercise as a citizen in order to move, towards a better Australia for everyone.
Any other questions? Just lady over here.
I've been thinking about how to put this question throughout the presentation tonight, and it speaks a lot to language and narrative and setting the tone for a dialogue, particularly. And I will make a reference to a little bit of my own experience here, although the fact that I feel I need to disclose it does contribute something to what my question is. Speaking as someone who has been subject to the mental health system, and that's how I choose to say it, what I would want in any situation is not to be privileged in a conversation, but to be respected, as I said, to be listened to appropriately, and for that to be appropriately considered any decisions taken. And I'm always a little bit frustrated when privilege is discussed in these kinds of discussions, to the degree that it may actually distract from the very important points that are there for the dialogue, for bringing everyone to the table and feeling that they are a part of the process. And I wanted to know from the speakers tonight whether they felt there was a need to change the dialogue, or how the concept of privilege is actually discussed within the conversation, particularly considering when it comes to the news and the media, everything is reduced to a soundbite and people are reacting emotionally to how they perceive that discussion.
Maybe while we think about a response to this, were there any other questions from the audience as well? Yes, we'll go this one in the back. Yeah.
Thank you very much for sharing all of your insights tonight with us. I have a couple of questions from our online attendees. I'll start with one. So this is from Caitlin, and she asked, can the panel comment on the role intersectionality plays as both an opportunity and a barrier for ownership in international affairs, particularly marginalised communities?
And then there was another question over here as well.
Yeah. My question was really, hello, thank you very much for your time tonight as well. I was just wondering, in each of your respective areas of expertise, do you think that the policy is getting intersectionality right? Like, is there any sort of area that you're working in that you feel like, yeah, okay, that was a truly intersectional policy, or is it all aspirational at this stage?
I think, yeah, 3 good questions. So one around the role of privilege and like reducing the conversation to that and how comfortable we are with that term. Question from online, intersectionality in terms of it being a barrier or an opportunity in this space, then also getting intersectionality right. So does anyone want to comment on any of those 3 questions?
Start generally and to say thank you for all the questions and for sharing your experiences. And I think it's a really important question. And I actually want to go to a different word that you brought up that I think is really important, and that is around dialogue, because I actually think we're talking about the structures and the systems that are set up to reinforce privilege in certain way, to reduce things to sound bites in certain ways, to ask people to appear and talk in very limited frames of view, right? Where your experience with the mental health system is not your totalizing experience and identity, right? And there's other things that come with it. And there's a lot of other ways of having conversations that the Westminster, whatever kinds of systems of policy making and government and all those kind of things are not set up to do, right? Consultations are not actually dialogue. They're taking information to make a decision, like those kind of questions and issues. So I think this question of how privilege can often function to shut down spaces and people's ability to have conversations is because the structures and systems are set up in ways that mean that people don't learn about other people as whole people in these exchanges, and we're asked very much to perform any of our roles in very limited ways, right? I mean, we've all done it on stage tonight whatever this is, in a particular way, right? Here are the little bits of my identity that are relevant to what I'm going to talk about, right? But it changes. We couldn't do that in an hour. Like if we had this conversation in a truly dialogical way towards finding truly intersectional, successful policy, we would need more than an hour, right? We need time, and we need space, and we need to come with different kinds of expectations of what this space would be. So it's like a sideways answer, but I think that's one of the, rather than putting it on the people, right, and saying that person hasn't contributed, or like who's being invited or not, it's what are the systems and structures that mean that this is where we are over and over again producing superficial kind of policy and engagement and those kinds of pressures and things. And I think that goes to these conversations about the politics of things, right, and where the motivations lie in those things. The other thing that I just might briefly say before I give up I feel like I've talked a lot, is actually just to link, I thought your comment about education is kind of really fundamental in your question about like how do you do something in this space, and then the questions about kind of barriers and opportunities. I think again, going to the structures rather than the people, these are processes that we have to learn how to engage. And I work with young peace activists and advocates that try and advocate at the UN kind of level. And there are a lot of youth coalitions at that level that run, or now, Zooms on how to get a meeting with the delegate when you're going to be there for the ECOSOC forum and these kind of knowledge exchanges for the language of being able to participate in those forums. And I actually think that Zoe's work in the domestic context is similar, right, in terms of capacity building to speak the right language, to have those kind of influences. So I think that that's an important dynamic and element, the work that goes on to truly enable people to access the spaces of conversation in these ways as well. Okay, I've talked too much.
Do you have any points to make?
I think maybe my response may touch on all three, and I want to go back to what Helen said about the framing. And I think that this is a limitation of the Western system and how we operate in the Western system, and the idea of siloing and the framing around, an Indigenous issue is just an Indigenous issue, a woman's issue is just a woman's issue, a mental health issue is just a mental health issue, without taking into consideration all the rest. And so it's a limitation of the system and how it functions and works, but it's actually how the system functions and works, and it's how it continues to perpetuate inequalities for people. And that's why it's so important that we interrogate those. So like I said right at the beginning when I first spoke, and Kimberly Crenshaw has openly said this, that intersectionality has not been explored the way that it should be explored, and we sort of sit on the surface. And it's important to sit on the surface so we understand it, but eventually we have to dive in. We have to do the analysis of power imbalances. We have to do the analysis of the structural barriers. I think to that question, the online question, I think the idea, what are some of like the barriers or positives? Opportunities. I think there is power in being self-aware, in understanding your privilege, and I don't mean to like throw that back around, but there's power in understanding where you sit, but it's also about how you use that, and rather than just, privileging something or understanding that you have privilege, about how you enact on that and how you actually transform or change something in society for other people. I think some of the barriers come from focusing too much on the deficit. I mean, we see that a lot in the Indigenous space. A lot of stuff is in the deficit lens. And so we always focus on those things. And I think sometimes when we do focus on those things, those people that are sitting in the room that have that privilege don't realise what they're sitting there with. And I think that's half the problem too. I think that it's very multifaceted. There's no simple answer. Intersectionality is very broad, very complex. In terms of has there been anything good, I think we can't even get the race policy right between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Not saying that it's the most simple, but it's because there is intersecting layers within that, but that's just sort of one large intersecting thing where you've got people willing to share their voices, but there's a political stopping thing there, political barrier there. Yeah, I think it comes down to I always talked about this with education as well, and it's about unpacking your backpack and understanding what you have in your backpack. Because when you're self-aware and you understand yourself, you can actually then be emotionally intelligent as well. And I think a lot of people underplay the importance of emotional intelligence to be able to do different things. And I think too, going back to my bit about the limitation of Western ways of doing things, which is one way that Indigenous people constantly keep putting the olive branch out about saying about Indigenous ways of being, knowing and doing, about how to have dialogue in respectful ways. About listening to people, because too with the language things, it happens to Indigenous people all the time too, because we come with a different understanding of how the world functions. And so when we're talking to people, we're both speaking, and I speak about this all the time, we're both speaking English, but we're not saying the same thing. And therefore it gets lost in translation and the policy doesn't get put through. So it's very important as well. And touching on what you also said about the different, types of people, South Asian people that have lived there, that have come here, that are born here. Same with Indigenous people. There are some Indigenous people that have lost their connection due to stolen generation and find out that they're Indigenous. And so there's a position, or there are people in the room that don't have that lived experience as well. So I think that's a really fundamental thing across it all. I think that's a key thing that's sort of from tonight.